Hello and welcome to this evening's Formations event with Dr. Joseph Farquharson. My name is Joshua Lockwood-Moran and I'm the Deputy Curator at Bonington Gallery. Formations is a public event series which foregrounds underrepresented artists, writers, thinkers and activists, which is run by the Nottingham-Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre and Bonington Gallery. You can watch all the previous events on our YouTube channels, so please do subscribe to keep up to date with future events. Tonight's talk is given by Joseph Farquharson, entitled Questioning Language and Knowledge, the Challenge to Creole-speaking Communities. This will be followed by a Q&A led by Ramisha Rafique. Dr. Joseph Farquharson is a senior lecturer in linguistics at the University of West Indies, Mona. Dr. Farquharson holds a BA in Linguistics and Spanish and a PhD in Linguistics from UWI and an MPhil in European Literature from the University of Cambridge. He has been serving as the coordinator for the Jamaican Language Unit since 2019 and is currently a member of the Communication and Information Advisory Committee for the Jamaica National Commission for UNESCO, and the convener of the subject panel for Cape Communication Studies. Ramisha Rafique is a studentship-funded PhD candidate at Nottingham-Trent University. Her creative critical doctoral thesis explores the ontology of postcolonial flaneurs considering class, language, religion, and global technological advancements. Her research interests include Islamophobia, British Muslim women's writing, and the flannery. The talk will cover what colonial and neo-colonial educational systems determine to be real knowledge and how these ideological systems designate the languages that are the vehicles of real knowledge. In societies where the mother language of the majority is a Creole language, like Jamaican and Haitian Creole, given their historic low status, they are not seen as a proper receptacle of knowledge. Joseph will explore the historical roots of these views and the ways in which they undermine and stunt the production, dissemination, and development of Indigenous forms of knowledge. This event will last about an hour, and we're delighted you can join us. Please write your questions in the YouTube chat or email us at formations@ntu.ac.uk. And also, please note that tonight's event includes live automated closed captioning, which is generated by Microsoft Teams, and this may include some mistakes. And so, without further ado, I'll hand over to Joseph for his talk. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Joshua. First, let me thank Bonington Gallery for inviting me to speak. And also in relation to a very important piece of work, which is Cedar Lewisohn's exhibition called Patois Banton. And I'm assuming that it was the patois in the Patois Banton that made me eligible to speak, as I have an interest in language, and to that what Cedar, is trying to accomplish through his work in the visual arts is probably not that very different from what I'm trying to accomplish as a linguist. Well, he works with different materials, some of them indigenous materials, ideas, shapes, images, and then reworks them into interesting stuff. And I work with languages that come from that sort of reworking, Creole languages. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So I thought it would be important to kind of define what Creole languages are. Although I'm starting there, I'll have to say that it's not easy to define Creole languages. And there's a lot of debate in the field that studies them. That field is called variably Creole linguistics or Creole studies, or more recently Creolistics. But we haven't really decided on what Creole languages are and how to define them, how to set them off from other languages formed out of contact. But I think what everybody is agreed on is that they are languages formed out of contact. And I would say people would agree that, in a sense, they are new languages. So there's a point in time in history where we could say Haitian Creole did not exist here. And so they, at least the ones that we study now, most of them are pretty new on the scene. And we would agree too that they are the native languages of the people who speak them, which would set them off from pidgins, which are generally used for short-term communication, although there are some languages which are designated as pidgins, which have existed over several generations. But what tends to happen for Creole languages is that it is the primary language for its speakers. It's their first language, their primary language, and they don't necessarily have something else to fall back on, which is different from the people who put the language together. So in the Atlantic region, those who put the language together would have had various African languages to fall back on, whereas the Creole languages were used for public interactions. So that's Creole languages and Creolistics in 2 minutes. I have not done it justice. These languages generally take a lot of vocabulary items from the dominant language in the space. And here I'm using dominant language to refer to the language of the group that has political, socio-political power in the. And so many of the words in Creole languages come from that language. In the case of, let's say, Trinidad and Tobago, well, let me not use Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica. In the case of Jamaica, that language is English. And English came into contact with various African languages. And then people working out a communication system that everybody could use created this new thing. And so you get a lot of words from the dominant language, but then you get many aspects of structure from the languages of the subjugated peoples in the area of syntax or sentence structure, also in the area of phonology, and so on. And so very often, European words and structures are made to behave, that's phonologically or in terms of their sounds, like how these African languages would have behaved. So sometimes if the European language has words with sounds coming together that are not typical of African languages, or the combinations are not typical of African languages, then the creators of the Creole will change those structures so they are more in line with the structures that they are used to. So if we look at the current situation in the Caribbean in terms of Creole languages are spoken right throughout the region. There are few territories that do not have a Creole language, and most of those are Spanish official territories. For some reason, Creole languages just did not emerge in the Spanish territories. Linguist John McWhorter has an explanation for that. The one Spanish Creole that we recognize in the region is Palenquero, which is spoken in Colombia, but there have been debates about its history and whether it might not have started out its life as a Portuguese-based Creole which then got overlaid with Spanish vocabulary and so on. And we have evidence too from Papiamento spoken in the ABC Islands that this sort of development is possible, where you start out with a Creole with a particular kind of base, a new dominant language is introduced to the environment, and the language kind of starts changing out its clothing and starts looking like something else. So most Caribbean territories, and I'm talking both the chain of islands that are generally associated with the Caribbean, as well as countries in Central America like Belize and Nicaragua, Honduras, as well as South America like Guyana and Suriname. So all of those are included. And what the language situation is in most, if not all, of these territories is that the Creole is the language that is most widely spoken, but the European language, we could say colonial language, tends to be the official language of the country. So in most of these territories, Creole languages do not have official status, with the exception of Haiti, where French and Haitian Creole have co-official status, and in the ABC Islands, that's Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, Papiamento is recognized. But in the English territories, which are the most numerous, the Creoles there are not recognized at all by governments, at least nothing that gives them official status for use in agencies of the state. And so there's this ongoing tension between Creole languages and the languages that they're associated with, or the official languages of the environment in those territories where Creoles are not official languages. And that ongoing tension leads to problems in these societies. What I'll be trying to do in this presentation is to explore the underlying or the undergirding issue, why there is this ongoing tension between the languages. Of course, there are two territories in which we have indigenous or pre-Columbian languages, so Arawakan languages, Caribbean languages, and Maya, and so on. So this creates for quite an interesting mix. But what I think is true for most of the territories, as I mentioned before, is that whether or not they have indigenous languages, the Creole language tends to be the lingua franca in the territory, used by everybody, including people who arrive more recently, which kind of gives us a sense of what people on the ground and visitors think about official policy, because visitors very soon understand and learn which language it is they need in order to communicate with people on the ground. So for example, in the case of Guyana in the 19th century, and Trinidad is the same, with the introduction of people from the Indian subcontinent. When they arrived, there was already a Creole in place. In the case of Trinidad, French Creole. In the case of Guyana, there was Dutch Creole and English Creole. And what tended to happen is that those new immigrants ended up speaking the English-related Creole in the territory, because by that time, the English-related Creole had become the language of wider communication. So I just wanted to set that background before going into the meat of my presentation. And what I am presenting today touches on two areas. There is, well, it's both philosophy, but one is philosophy of language that I can say I think I'm qualified to say something about, and the other is still within philosophy, but this is philosophy outside of my discipline, and that is epistemology. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the technical terms, etc., but I wanted you to understand that the part of philosophy of language that I'm looking at here really has to do with concepts that people have about language. So what are their perceptions of what is or is not a language? And on what basis is that perception founded? So it is common in Western literate societies to think of languages as things that have written grammars, things that have dictionaries, and things that have a lot of literature written down in it or in them. But if we used those criteria, then probably more than 80% of the languages spoken across the world would fail as languages, because the majority of communication systems used by human beings across the world do not have writing systems, do not have a large body of written literature, and so on and so forth. And so it's really looking at how that frames how we think about language. And in post-colonial societies, like the societies of the Caribbean, we take many of our notions of what languages are or what they should be from Western and from European, especially Western European notions of language. And then epistemology having to do with knowledge and theories of knowledge, not only in how do we come to know, but what is knowledge itself. And I take that up a bit in this presentation. So language is generally defined as a system of symbols, of a system of communication that involves symbols. And that mention of symbols goes back to Saussure and his concept of the linguistic sign, where these items or elements in language are pairings of sound and meaning. In his system, he referred to that as a signifier and signified, well, at least the English versions of the terms he used. And so language is this system of symbols. But the important thing about language, which sets it off from other types of communication, especially animal communication, is that it has this generative power, it's productive, and this is what allows us to be able to send new messages in language. And so it's not a rigid system where you have a set of symbols, and that set of symbols can only be used to send a very limited and restricted set of messages. So for example, if I wanted to say, I was dancing on the moon last night with a woman who had a purple head and a green tongue, I am hoping that that sentence has never been uttered in the history of mankind, of humanity. But language allows you to do that. So we can generate new sentences and utterances once we have the grammar, the rules in our head. And then for the matter of, so that's what we mean when we talk about a language. And on that basis, there are other properties too, but on that basis, then Creole languages qualify as full languages because their speakers can use them to talk about whatever they want to talk about. There is an issue though, and I'm going to come back to that issue when I look at diglossia in language. So on the matter of epistemology and what is knowledge, knowledge is generally thought of as facts or skills that one gathers from experience or from searching. Um, we're also interested too in the value of knowledge. So not only what is knowledge, but what value does knowledge have? And I think that is the tension that we have in societies like ours. It's a tension between how people view language, what they think knowledge is, and then the value of that of that knowledge. And that's what I want you to keep in mind as I go forward. So I did say I was going to come to diglossia. And this section of my talk I'm referring to as ideological schizophrenia and diglossia. Um, Let me deal with diglossia first. And I just did something that I tell my students not to do. So don't give 1 and 2 and then deal with 2 before you deal with 1. I'm going to break my own rule. Diglossia is a term in linguistics which refers to a language situation in which you have, and how it was originally thought of, is where you have a language, well, one language, but that language has different varieties. To simplify matters, let's say we have 2 varieties, and those 2 varieties do different work. They have distinct domains, and they are not expected to overlap in terms of domains. So the language that is used in education is not the language that is used when you're having a conversation with your friend in a cafe. The language that is used for news broadcast is not the language that is used when you're talking to your intimate partner. And so on and so forth. The first type of variety is called the high variety, because with it goes high prestige, and the other one is called the low variety, having low prestige. Now, the thing is that in a diglossic situation, as it was conceptualized by Charles Ferguson, is that many members of the society use both varieties, the high and the low. They have this schizophrenia where they use the high for only these things and the low for only those other things. But in some situations, people will deny that they can speak the low variety. So it's not infradig for you to, to admit that you speak the low variety. Now that is very typical. That thing that I just described as diglossia is very typical of many Caribbean societies, where the official language, generally a European language, has high prestige, and the Creole language has low prestige. And even in the case of Haiti, although Haitian Creole is an official language, they are still battling with the historical low prestige of Haitian Creole. And so you don't get rid of that. Now, added to that, on the knowledge side, is what I refer to as ideological schizophrenia, in what things are good, what things are desirable in Caribbean societies, Caribbean communities. And much of that is guided by a history, a century, in some cases more, of colonial brainwashing about what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes good knowledge, or overall what constitutes good. So standards of beauty, standards of how society should be ordered, should be organized. All of those generally come, at least for officialdom, come from European culture. And so there's this ideological split, which resembles diglossia on the linguistic side, where things that have their origin in Europe are thought of as good, but things that have their origin in Africa or India or in the Caribbean, which means they're local creations, those are generally perceived as not as good or even bad. And so that's what I want to explore here. So all of this has to be taken against the background of how the majority populations in Caribbean societies have been viewed over centuries, starting first with the enslaved Africans who were forcibly taken from their homeland and brought to the Caribbean to work on plantations, and then later on Indians and Chinese, etc. And I'm starting this particular section with an 18th century historian in Jamaica called Edward Long, because Edward Long, in volume 2 of his book, The History of Jamaica, it's a 3-volume work, has something to say. So he goes off on this. He's talking about Jamaica. He's talking about the people of Jamaica, the Negroes, which was the term he used, they used then, and the whites, and then Creole blacks and Creole whites, Creoles being those who were born in the New World. And then he goes off on this tangent, discussing orangutans and baboons and so on, and discussing them in relation to peoples of Africa. I have some excerpts here. So he says that the Hottentot, which is the old term for the Khoi, the old and no longer in vogue term for the Khoi of Southern Africa, he says, from this portrait, they are a more manly figure than the orangutan. So he's comparing the Khoi to animals. And this is pre-Darwinian, so it's not in the Darwinian sense that we are all animals, but in the sense that, and I have evidence to bear that out later on, that the orangutan and some races of black men are very nearly allied. Some races of black men is, I think, more than probable. That is Edward Long speaking. And then he goes on to make a comparison between man, and here it is clear that by man he's referring to white man, which is why I generally say to people when they quote the US founding document, we hold these truths to be self-evident that, you know, all men are created equal. That use of man or men does not include black people. So he says here, I think it's more than probable. So he makes a contrast between man and his slaves, the inferior animals. He says that explicitly. And then he goes on to say the orangutan's brain is a senseless icon of the human, that it is mere matter, unanimated with a thinking principle in any or at least in a very minute and imperfect degree. We must then infer the strongest conclusion to establish our belief of a natural diversity of the human intellect in general ab origine. An orangutan in this case is a human being, pod, his form and organs, so in relation to his form and organs, but of an inferior species, quod, his intellect. He has in form a much nearer resemblance to the Negro race than the latter bear to white men. And then he finishes off. Sorry, I don't have everything here. It was just what I could stand at the moment of extraction. The Negro race, using progressively in the scale of intellect, I think that is, the further they mount above the orangutan and brute creation. And then he speaks about the Hottentots again, the Khoi, that they are a lazy and stupid race. And I wanted to focus on that thinking principle he mentioned there. And why I'm zeroing in on the thinking principle is because in many schools of thought, thinking is linked to language. There are some people who believe that we couldn't think if we didn't have language, and vice versa. We can't think if we don't have language. Yeah. Um, I've mentioned that point because the Creole languages of the Caribbean, the Creoles of the Caribbean, have generally been thought of as not languages. And once you undermine the languagehood of the main communication system of a group of people, you are striking at the heart of their humanity, so their ability to think, and whether or not they possess an intellect. And that has severely damaged us in the Caribbean, in terms of because people think that Creole languages don't constitute real languages. Whatever is done in Creole languages is thought to be not the product of thought, and is thought not to be good enough. And here I'm getting to my main point. Luckily, concepts like Edward Long was overturned by the work of Noam Chomsky in the middle of the last century, where he put forward the idea that what was important was knowledge of language. And what he meant by knowledge there was what existed or what exists in the brains of native speakers. And so he overturned centuries of prescriptive or the grammarian type approach to language, where language was focused on speaking beautifully, writing beautifully, and then only a few people really had language. And Chomsky said, no, all human beings have language and have a capacity for language. And that knowledge is what linguistics is really intended to discover. And that revolutionized thinking that, oh, how Black people could now have languages because it's really the knowledge in speakers' heads. And in the 1950s, 1960s, much of what took place in Creolistics, even into the 70s, was really, in a sense, a way of taking up Chomsky's challenge in order to see if the languages spoken in these societies were really languages. Chomsky's theory, unfortunately, and this is his concept of universal grammar, there was a spin-off by Derek Bickerton, who had what he termed as a language by a program hypothesis. And the language by a program for Bickerton was essentially what happened in a human brain when that person wasn't exposed to a full language. So the typical thing is to be exposed to a full language. Spanish speakers get exposed to, Spanish babies get exposed to people who speak Spanish, and then they acquire Spanish, etc. But in this case, Bickerton says there are cases in which children are not exposed to a full language, and the children have to use this aspect of their brain, this pre-wiring, in order to create a new language system. And that is how, for him, Creole languages emerged. Linguist Michel de Graaf has responded to this at length, pointing out how it really puts down speakers of these languages because it treats their languages as linguistic fossils, or worse, as being lower down on the evolutionary scale than European languages and other languages. And this can be seen too, even with African languages. There's something I've pointed out very often to my students, and this is for them to watch how people speak about different languages and the labels that they give to them. So people will talk about the Spanish language, the French language, the Polish language, the Dutch language, but then they talk about the North American, the Indian dialects and the African dialects. Why don't the First Nation peoples of America have languages. And again, this is because of the particular philosophy that people have of language, that language um, must have books and so on. So this is a bibliophilic, is that a word, approach to knowledge. And this has plagued Caribbean societies because most Caribbean societies, most Caribbean communities are oral cultures where information is passed down, but the dominant structures gave pride of place to written information. And so oral information is devalued and written information is placed on a pedestal. Now, what this does is that it places oral cultures at a disadvantage. And I don't just want to say cultures, I want to make it explicit that it's the people that we place at a disadvantage. Because what the dominant culture does, and then what the people end up doing to themselves, is that they hold things that they have created, language included, as being inferior, as being not good enough. So here we are touching on what is knowledge. We have societies in which knowledge, real knowledge, comes in the form of books, in printed material. And then you have this thing that we do, that my grandmother told my mother and my mother told me, etc. But that's not really important knowledge, if it is knowledge at all. That's just something that we have had in our family for generations. Now, the interesting thing is that the societies that they are up against, or the cultures that they're up against, all of the science and technology came out of an engagement and a re-engagement of indigenous knowledge. And so it's European societies taking, well, either Grimm's fairy tales, well, not Grimm's fairy tale yet, but taking local fairy tales and building on them to Grimm fairy tales to the masterpieces of literature that we have today. It has to do with European societies taking herbs, medicinal plants, doing research on them, and then coming up with pharmaceuticals. But what has happened because of the ideological schizophrenia within these communities is that whatever knowledge was passed on orally, even if they have been helping for generations, they are ignored because real knowledge is to be found in a book. And so this stunts the growth and the development of knowledge in these societies because of this dichotomy between what is real knowledge and what is folk knowledge, really. So our thing gets classified as folk, and the problem is that folk generally dies out with succeeding generations if there isn't continuous engagement and development. So this affects, and I'm coming to the close, this affects the arts, it affects technology, and it affects science, medicine, etc. In the sense that, and I just said that, we end up not developing indigenous knowledge because we have placed it in a box as something that belongs to the folk and belongs in the past. And we have bought into somebody else's concept of knowledge. So here I'm not saying that indigenous knowledge is always right, but what happened in European context or Western cultures is that indigenous knowledge was subjected to testing, retesting, and development, whereas that is very often missing in our communities. So the really significant area that we find a problem is in the education system, because in most territories of the Caribbean where Creole languages are spoken, Creoles are not recognized for use in the education system. Very often, they probably allow them to be used, but they're used as a crutch when students don't understand. The interesting thing would be, but if students understand better when they're addressed in Creole, why aren't we teaching them in Creole? As opposed to trying to teach them in something else. And then when that fails, and there is evidence that it is failing more than it's succeeding, then they switch to Creole. So the impact is felt greatest in education, because the majority of material that children are going to meet in the education system is material in the official/European language, and that will solidify for them the link between what is real knowledge and the language that real knowledge comes in. And so the challenge, as I close, to Creole using societies is that we have to learn to disentangle the strands, to understand that we are creators of knowledge. Either this is the knowledge that comes in the languages that we speak, or the knowledge that is conveyed in the languages that we speak. So knowledge about how we interface with our environment. The challenge is for us to disentangle those two pieces, understanding that they're not one and the same. So European cultures, European languages do not have a monopoly on what language, on what knowledge is. But they don't have a monopoly on what language is either. But they don't have a monopoly on what knowledge is. The knowledge, the wisdom passed down to us by our foreparents is also valid. The challenge is, what are we going to do as the present generation about the knowledge that they have given us? How will we develop that knowledge in the same way that these other societies have developed their own indigenous knowledge? Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was saying thank you, Joseph, for such a rich and informative talk. I'm sure the audience have many questions, so we're just going to see if there are any questions coming in. But if not, I have a really interesting one prepared for you. I just don't want to be selfish and ask mine. So we have a question from Jenny R. Are there any Creole poets or novelists you would recommend to readers?
There are lots. There are lots. I think in the case of well, let me start with one that would be familiar to people in the UK. So Linton Kwesi Johnson is an important figure, extremely important figure, who works in, I think, what he refers to as nation language, which is the term that was used by Professor Kamau Brathwaite. So he is important, working in dub and other forms. For the case of Jamaica, a lot of people would know the work of Louise Bennett. She started her public work in the 1940s and worked for several decades in poetry, in media, so doing radio plays, radio dramas, children's programs on television. And what is important about her is that she worked mainly in the Creole language, in the Jamaican language, which at that time, there was a lot of prejudice against the language. And people, were asking her, why are you doing this? As an intelligent woman, why would you do this with your time and with your intellect? Which reminds us of the diglossia that I spoke about. So those are the ones that come to mind in terms of Jamaica. In Guyana, there are a few others, and the name has slipped out of my head, and I should know it. I should beat myself. And over on the French side, there are a few persons who have worked in French Creoles. The names are not coming to mind. I'm avoiding the names so as not to misrepresent people. But there are works, and there's a growing body of work too. And because of the work of people like Louise Bennett, Césaire on the French Caribbean side, etc., there is a growing body of literature, and there are fewer inhibitions these days about writing in the Creole language. There are still concerns about market, whether people will be able to read what they have written, but the body of literature is growing.
Thank you very much. Just having a look to see if there are any other questions. So I have a question, if I may. I recently read an essay of yours, which I told you about, titled Folk Linguistics and Post-Colonial Language Politics. Apologies if I mispronounced anything there, in which you make some really interesting points regarding neo-colonial politics. And I wonder if you could tell us more about this in the context of the domains of language that you discussed in your talk today.
Okay, so yeah, that paper is old.
But very interesting.
One of my very early papers. So, folk linguistic and language politics, was it? Linguistic politics. Looked at the situation in Jamaica, exploring the folk beliefs that people have of language. And that puts me in a difficult situation, because as a scholar who is moving into the decolonial territory, I should exercise a certain amount of respect of what people think about their own languages. But at the same time, I am mindful that what they think about their own languages, those perceptions don't exist in a vacuum. They were born of colonial attitudes to languages, Creole languages, that just didn't die. And so it's taken in that perspective. So the paper examines the discourse, the national discourse on language in Jamaica. So uses quite a few newspaper articles, people writing to the editors to oppose or support the officialization of Jamaican or recognition of Jamaican. But also looking at how the language situation in Jamaica is kind of a mirror of the class structure in the country. So we have this thing, this little ditty that I knew growing up, which says, if you're white, all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, stay back. And that reflects the approach to language in Jamaica. White, we are equating with English here. That's the white, that's all right. The black that stays back is the Creole language, which a lot of people hope would die, and not a slow, painful death, a very quick death, so that, other people can get on with their lives. And then in the middle, we have mixtures between the Creole and English, which reflect this sort of middle class, emerging ethos, where people are trying to deal with what they know they're expected to do, how they're expected to speak in order to move up in society. But then there are these roots. And so how do they deal with these two things? So one thing that they're being told to get rid of, but it's very much a part of who they are. And this other thing that they are told that it will give you access to resources. Yeah, so that's what I try to do in that paper. I think we have moved on, luckily, from there. So we're not at the same place. Right now, the National Standards Curriculum in Jamaica, which was introduced in 2018, says that children should be bilingual, that they should be able to speak and write in both languages. Problem is that the government put in the new curriculum, but it didn't train the teachers to operate differently. And so we are going to have the same results we've been having for more than a century now, or half a century since education became more widespread. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I actually have a really relevant question to move on to from that by Annalise Edwards, and it's, in what ways can we challenge the government's resistance to decolonizing the curriculum in order to engage with the context and histories you've mentioned today in the UK education system?
Ooh. Okay. Oh, you're talking the UK. I tend not to pick wars with countries I don't belong to, because the war that I have to fight in my own country is it takes up a lot of my time. But I think a part of what you're mentioning, and if I understand the question, which is an excellent question, it's about the existence of people who speak Creole languages in the British space, and how the education system in the UK deals with them. I would say, I don't want to be pessimistic and say, it will not change until Caribbean societies and African societies change their outlook. But it would help if Caribbean societies changed, because in a situation where Creole languages are declared as official with all of the state backing that implies, it means that when a society like the UK or the US or Canada or France discriminates against the speaker of a Creole language, then there is really serious grounds. Because the question is, why aren't you treating this in the same way that you would treat a case of a child speaking Polish, or a child speaking Ukrainian or Russian, etc. So I'd say Caribbean societies, African societies have to make a move. So I'm not going to release us from responsibility. And now to speak a bit in favor of societies like the UK and Canada. In the UK and Canada, Creole speakers, I'm not sure if this is the case for all, but there are definitely some provisions for Creole speakers to get access to interpreters when they come before the legal system. In Jamaica, although the Constitution makes provision for that, most Jamaicans, especially Jamaicans who are monolingual speakers of Jamaican Creole, do not get to access that. Because although the Constitution says, if you speak a language other than English, then you have the right to an interpreter. We have not yet come to an agreement that Jamaican Creole is not English. And so the question the court is going to ask is, why do you need an interpreter when you are Jamaican? I saw an interesting thing the other day. I was in court, and there was a Chinese man who had been brought before the court and was being charged, and the sentencing had to be done in Jamaican Creole. He's a recent immigrant. Now he just got access to a right that many Jamaicans do not have access to, because it's thought because you're Jamaican, you should understand English. So again, I hope I've answered the question. If I haven't, let me know.
Thank you very much. If there's not any more questions, are there any more questions? Just put it out there. Well, if there's not, I'd just like to wrap it up there and say thank you to yourself, first of all, for such a fascinating and engaging talk. And Joshua, thank you everything you've been doing in the background. And also thank you to our amazing audience for listening, for joining us this evening, and for your questions. The next event will be next Thursday for 50 years of New Beacon Books with Gus Khan and Yolanda Lear. So we'll see you there. Have a good evening. Goodbye.